Hey everybody, welcome back to Tim Travels. This is Terry, your host. Still coming to you from Minnesota. So last night I was, place I parked, I just walked and got some dinner. I was coming back through this little park and I was thinking about the first Minnesota since I'm up here in Minnesota. And I wanted to talk about that for a second here. So the first Minnesota was an infantry regiment that was formed here in Minnesota at the start of the Civil War. Now it just so happened that the governor of Minnesota, Governor Ramsey, was in Washington D.C. when, and this is, so just to give you the time frame, around April 14th, 1861, and he's there in D.C. when the Confederates bombard Fort Sumter, basically starting the Civil War. So he immediately tells President Lincoln, hey, I'm pledging 1,000 volunteers for the war effort. And, you know, he was the first state governor because, you know, there was a standing regular Union Army, or actually, I shouldn't say Union Army, Army of the United States, right? United States Army. But, you know, it wasn't very big. And, you know, because we didn't go fight wars overseas. We weren't prepared for the communist menace or anything back then. So it wasn't very big. It just had outposts around the country. And so the vast majority of the troops that Lincoln needed to suppress this Confederate rebellion were going to come from the states, getting volunteers together and getting people to come fight. And so Governor Ramsey's willingness to put together a regiment immediately was important. Because Lincoln had called for 75,000 troops from all the states. Now, certainly Minnesota was not the most populous state in the Union, not even by a long shot. But people here in Minnesota heard the governor's pledge and immediately started volunteering, and they kind of descended on Fort Snelling, which is in the Twin Cities area, just south. It's actually right by the airport, if you know where the Minneapolis-St. Paul airport is. So anyway, most of those troops came from companies that were formed in and around eastern Minnesota. So there were a couple companies from St. Paul, one from Minneapolis, one from Faribault, one from Red Wing, couple other places, Hastings, Minnesota. So anyway, they get on some river steamers and head down the Mississippi and eventually take a train to the east. And they end up fighting in a lot of the important battles in the east. First Bull Run, Antietam, and then they're at Gettysburg. So this is where the first Minnesota becomes possibly the most important regiment in the history of the Union Army, at least in the Civil War. So what happens at Gettysburg is that on the second day, right, Union forces have their lines basically along Cemetery Ridge, up Little Round Top, and up to Round Top, or Big Round Top, depending on what you want to call it. And the Union 3rd Corps under Major General Dan Sickles, who is a novice soldier but a cocky politician. By the way, Sickles is a guy who, as a congressman, murdered in broad daylight in Lafayette Square, right next to the White House, his wife's lover. And the guy's name was I think Philip Barton Key, and he was the son of Francis Scott Key, by the way. And Sickles murders him, and this is around, I think, 1856, and Sickles' defense attorney is none other than William Stanton, who would end up becoming the Secretary of War in the Lincoln administration. Stanton posits what is regarded as the first insanity defense, and he gets Sickles off, right? Like, Sickles does not get found guilty of the murder, and he and his wife continue to live in D.C., although they were kind of pariahs. He doesn't divorce his wife either. They just stay married. Anyway, so that's this Dan Sickles. So Sickles, disobeying orders, advances the Union Third Corps off of the high ground, which, if you know anything about 19th century military tactics, you don't give up the high ground, right? That's what Hooker did with Sickles' Corps at Chancellorsville. Anyway, Sickles advances, contrary to his orders from Meade, down the slope into what is called the Peach Orchard. Well, what he does is he also exposes the Third Corps to a flanking movement by the Confederates at their front, right? Like, he basically created a flank that they didn't even have to turn. All they had to do, they didn't have to go very hard. All they had to do was, like, a left face, and bam, they're able to enfilade the flank of the Union Third Corps. So what happens is the Third Corps is decimated, and the Southerners start driving them back. So it just so happened that the 1st Minnesota, with about 252 troops, is on either side of some artillery positions on Cemetery Ridge in the Union 2nd Corps area. And as you'll recall, the Union 2nd Corps commander is none other than Winfield Scott Hancock, one of my favorite generals from the Civil War. And Hancock realizes what's happening, and there's an entire brigade getting ready to basically, because the Cemetery Ridge portion of the Union lines was sparsely manned, because the fighting, if you recall, on the 2nd of July, a lot of it was at the right and the left of the Union flanks. So the right being Culp's Hill area, and the left being the Round Tops. And keep in mind, the famous gate hinge charge of the 20th Maine occurred on 2nd of July. So anyway, there's a danger, though, that the Union lines are going to be rent asunder, and they're going to and that the Confederates are going to punch through at Cemetery Ridge. Winfield Scott Hancock sees this and says, I got to bring up reinforcements ASAP. But he needed to slow down the Confederates. So he rides up to Colonel William Colville, who is the regimental commander of the 1st Minnesota, and says, what unit is this? He tells him it's the 1st Minnesota. He's like, I need you guys to go right there and fight those guys. And what was in front of the 1st Minnesota, because the 1st Minnesota's task was made basically to support artillery batteries, right? You would typically have an infantry unit so that cavalry couldn't ride up on a battery and kill all the artillerymen quickly. So you would have infantry to protect an artillery position. Not a lot, but so we're talking 250 men, right? So anyway, and the other reason is it's hard to move artillery quickly. You can't just, like, if somebody's coming at you, you can't just be like, oh, let's leave, pick up the cannons and leave. No, you got to hook them up to limbers, get the horses, the teams put on there, and so it's not something that happens quick. That's why you have to have infantry to protect artillery positions. So anyway, the 1st Minnesota goes out and with about 250 men engages like 1,200 Confederates. And they basically just go headlong into these guys. They suffer an 82% casualty rate in that engagement. They finally pull back because they get some reinforcements. They didn't give up anything. They just went in there and just went crazy and stop the Confederates in their tracks, because the Confederates outnumbered them 5-1, but these guys put up such a fight that the Confederates couldn't advance, and then that gave time for Hancock to bring up some reinforcements, withdraw them into the lines that would eventually be the Union center that would get reinforced on the night of the 2nd, which is where Pickett's charge would occur the next day. 82% casualty rate. And by the way, the guys that were left standing ended up staying in position and being part of the Union defenders that withstood the brunt of Pickett's charge. But I want to, and I want to say that this is, it's important to just think about people's ancestors and stuff. And I'm sure there are people here in Minnesota who have ancestors that were in the first Minnesota. And these guys went a long way. Gettysburg is a long way from here. I'm in western Minnesota, but Gettysburg is a long way from, Hastings, Minnesota. And a lot of these guys left home and never came back. And Hancock had this to say about the first Minnesota. He said, "No soldiers on any field in this or any other country ever displayed grander heroism." And he went on to say, "There is no more gallant deed recorded in history." Now, that is saying something very profound. It's coming from a guy who was well regarded. He was a professional soldier. He eventually was a candidate for president, and his reputation is pretty good. And that's what he had to say about the first Minnesota. And there were lots of Army units he was associated with over his career. But here's something that was said years later by somebody who wasn't at Gettysburg, but who was the president of the United States. And this was President Coolidge, Calvin Coolidge. He said this: "Colonel Colville and those 8 companies of the 1st Minnesota are entitled to rank as saviors of their country." And he said that on July 4th, 1928, in Cannon Falls, Minnesota, when they were dedicating a monument to Colonel William Colville, the regimental commander. So, those two people, important figures in history in their own right, couldn't speak more highly of the 1st Minnesota. And there are actually 2 monuments to the 1st Minnesota at the Gettysburg battlefield. So if you get a chance to visit, take a second to stop at the 1st Minnesota monuments, because they're well deserved. So anyway, that's a little Minnesota history, a little Civil War history. So I wanted to talk about knowing when to say when. And this is it's something that a lot of us have a problem with. My wife has said to me on more than one occasion that I would stick with things longer than I should have. And I've been thinking a lot about Tom Brady, not in a football sense, but just because I said earlier, don't read the press about his marriage, or that whether because I see headlines, right? So I know what some of these articles are about, like, oh, he hired attorneys, or his wife hired an attorney, or they did this or did that. And I'm like, I see all these articles and I'm like, man, I feel like Tom Brady didn't know when to say when. And just because you can still do something doesn't mean you should do it. And it's hard to know when to just take a step back and say, is it time for me to be done with this phase of my life, or is it time for me to be done with something I've been doing, and maybe something that I really enjoy doing, but is it time to move on? And I see a lot of Tom Brady in people that are in the military. I used to go to military retirement ceremonies, and I can remember I was as a young guy, I was like, why is this Master Chief up there crying at it? I went to a retirement one time. We had this boiler tech Master Chief, and to me he seemed like he was like 100 years old, but he was probably only in his like early 40s, but I was like a teenager still. And I go to this retirement ceremony, and the dude is so emotional. He's so choked up about basically just getting a pension and going on to his next job that his wife has to give his remarks at his own retirement. Like he can't bring himself to speak. And I was like, wow, that's weird. But the longer I stayed in, the more I understood it. And I wasn't that way at my own retirement, but it wouldn't surprise me to learn there were people like that at other retirements. And I gotta say, I every time I would go to a retirement, it would be like this bitter, even when it wasn't my retirement. I remember I worked for my battalion officer when I was at the Naval Academy. Was a Marine Lieutenant Colonel, and he and I were pretty close. We had reported at the same time, and we just we had he and I were just close. We kind of thought the same way about things, and we've been in touch over, we've stayed in touch over the years in our career, after retirement. And when he retired, I was like, I was kind of emotional, that he was retiring. He was a helicopter pilot, by the way. He was I won't say his name, but he knows who he is. But yeah, he was he flew Marine One. Like I've seen pictures of him where like Ronald Reagan was getting in the helicopter, and he was in the cockpit, waiting for the president to get on board to fly him to Andrews or whatever. But I was like, I was kind of emotional when he retired, because I helped out with ceremony and stuff, and so it's always bittersweet when you stop doing something that you've been doing for a long time and that you put a lot into. And so I understand what Tom Brady's going through in a way, right? Here's a guy who's been doing something, and if you've ever met somebody that's a professional athlete, or even somebody that's a really accomplished collegiate athlete, like a swimmer, just to give you an example, I had a gal one time who was on the swim team at the Naval Academy. And, she came in my office and she was tearful because she really wanted to quit swimming. And a comment she made has always stuck with me. She says, I've been swimming, and I like to swim, but I've been swimming every day since I was like 5 years old. And that sounds extreme, or like maybe an exaggeration, but I'm pretty sure that was true. Like every day that she could be in a pool, she was. And if you ever had a kid that swam or wrestled or did anything, it's like it's all consuming. I know a guy that played basketball at an ACC school, and he was telling me, how just demanding it was. And it's a full-time job. And so I look at a guy like Tom Brady, and I'm sure Tom Brady has been wearing shoulder pads. The guy's 45 years old. He's probably been wearing shoulder pads almost 90% of his entire life. Like I would be willing to bet he started playing football when he was, 7 years old or something. 6, 7 years old maybe. So, and last year he wanted to retire, and I guess, maybe some people stole his thunder or whatever. It's hard to keep a secret. But part of his, like, I think part of the problem he had was he didn't have an after plan. Because doing something at that level, at that intensity, requires almost all of your energy. And so he not only didn't have an after plan, but he also, because he didn't have an after plan, he couldn't just imagine what he would do. It's like, I've read stuff about people that were like ran for president but weren't elected, and what the day after the election is like. It's like no more Secret Service protection. It's just like it's like you fell off the face of the earth. And so Brady decides, well, I'm going to go back for one more season. Except psychologically, his wife had, and maybe his family, other people, had kind of moved on. They were like, okay, last year was the end of it. So he had started doing that, but for some reason he goes back. And now I think he's really unhappy. And it's not just wins or losses, right? I mean, like, I saw some press about everybody's dragging him because they lost to the Steelers. Anybody could lose. Any professional team can lose to any professional team any day of the week. And if you don't believe me, just look what the Jets did to the Packers today. Okay? The difference is Tom Brady has 6 more rings than Aaron Rodgers. Okay? But anybody can win on any given day. They're all professional athletes. Like, even the worst player in the NFL is still pretty damn good at football. So, and so getting back to the idea that sometimes we're not ready for change, it is really, really hard, right? Human beings are resistant to change. And I thought I had a plan when I retired from the military. But what I didn't realize is that, the military, even though it's a lot of people that are high achievers, it's also a lot of people that are high achievers in that environment. And, it's a slap in the face when you get out, right? When you retire, or even just you get out after 4 years, right? And you're like, oh, well, this is how you act if you're a professional. And, you take a job and, at whatever, and maybe it's not what because maybe you don't know what you want to do, because maybe you just don't know. And you take a job and your boss, your manager, is some freaking snot-nosed 28-year-old that still lives at home with his mom and has never done jack. And you have all this life experience, and you got to listen to this dork who doesn't know anything, but he's just like, telling everybody what to do, and he has bad ideas. And, like, I saw that when I was, like, working at Estes. Like, they couldn't figure out, they'd be like, well, why does everybody go to lunch at the same time? Well, because there was no structure, right? There was no leadership. There was no accountability from the leaders. Like, the way they led was, well, if you don't do something, we'll write you up. Or if you do something wrong, we'll write you up. There was no command structure. You didn't even know, like, there were, like, the people that were your shift leaders would leave at the end of their shift, even though you weren't allowed to leave, right? Like, you had to ask permission to leave, even though you'd already worked 8 hours. And then, like one time, this guy came up to me. I didn't know who he was. It's not like he had rank. It's not like he wore a special color, like, safety vest or anything. And I was like, he just starts telling me to do stuff. I was basically like, get the F out of my face. And then somebody else comes and they're like, hey, you can't say that. I'm like, yeah, I can. What are you going to do about it? And they're like, well, I'll write you up. And I didn't even know who these people were, And I was like, no wonder you guys can't keep anybody around here. And it was so funny because the one dude that I, like, kind of had made common with, if that's the right way to say it, common cause with, is a dude that was an old guy. And he would tell people to F themselves every night, like clockwork. Well, so then I just started, like I was like, I'll stay out of his way because, he could be a workplace shooter. It turns out that this guy he was a legit badass. He enlisted in the Navy in 1960, and he was in UDT 21. Now, UDTs were the predecessors to the SEAL teams. So he was Navy Special Warfare before there even were SEAL teams. And he was in from 60 to 69. So you do the math, you're like, oh, what was that guy up to during 9 years in the Navy? So he and I got along great, although he had gotten out and been in trucking and stuff like that. But we got along great, and I just kind of took my lead from him. I was like, just tell everybody you don't like to F off, and what are they going to do about it, And, but, I'm sharing this with you not because I have any answers. I honestly think that Tom Brady, first of all, Tom Brady, and he is, there's no one, I don't think you're ever going to see a quarterback with 7 Super Bowl rings again. He's not the GOAT, he's the unicorn, right? Because, a lot of people have passing stats and everything, but think about everybody that has played, if you follow the NFL at all, that has played in the NFL. The only other person I know of that has more than 2, I think maybe more than 2 rings, is Terry Bradshaw. Now, I'm not an NFL historian, so there might be somebody else. But, like I think back even to the earliest days, like Bart Starr, 2. Bob Greasy, 2. The Mannings, 2 each. Roethlisberger, 2. Right? Like, I can't come up with anybody that's, Bradshaw's kind of in between everybody and Brady. But then there's just Brady. And so, there's nothing anybody can say that's going to tarnish Brady's image. And people are like, oh, why'd he come back from retirement if he was going to play this poorly? I don't think Brady's playing poorly. Is he what he was 10 years ago? Probably not. But who of us are? But here's the thing. Brady's still better than at least half the quarterbacks in the league. I would put money on that. But he's already psychologically done, and now he's just going through the motions. And anybody that's going through the motions that's already psychologically done, it just isn't a good product. So if you find yourself, and I'm talking to people that are in trucking or not in trucking, people reach out to me on email and stuff. If you find yourself just not looking forward to what you got to do on a daily basis, I'm not saying you got to love every minute of it, but you got to at least be to the point where it doesn't make you miserable. And I think Tom Brady's miserable. I think that the Buccaneers could win out this year, win their division. They're still tied for first after 6 games. I mean, they're not that bad. They're 500, right? I think they'll win their division probably. But I just don't care. I'm not even sure if winning the Super Bowl is going to make him that happy. He'll go out on a high note, but I'm not sure it will have been any joy. And oftentimes, a lot of times people at high levels, they perform at high levels and they get superior results, and they still are not that happy about it. And I know that from personal experience. When I was making the most amount of money that I had ever made, I wasn't happier than I am now. Not by a long shot. I wasn't, psychologically as comfortable as I am now. I wasn't, I was that guy on the road that's pissed off about traffic. I was that guy that was, I wasn't a total Kevin or whatever you want to say, but a lot of times I was just, I was a jerk or whatever. And, so I feel for Brady. I mean, I know he's exceedingly wealthy, but money doesn't buy happiness. And you know, I've met a lot of people in my life that were very satisfied and never made a lot of money, but they were content. So if you find yourself in that place where you're like, yeah, I make plenty of money, but I'm not happy, then it's time to start thinking about what you can do next. And if what you can do next, what you want to do next, is something that doesn't make you as much money, then start preparing now for it, and then you'll still be content. You won't have to worry about the bills, but you'll be a lot happier. So anyway, best of luck to Mr. Brady and his family, and you know, love to hear your comments, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.